Anime's scariest characters aren't always the ones who know they're evil. Sometimes they're the ones who think they're right. Light thinks he's creating justice. Lelouch thinks he's fixing the world. Eren thinks he's chasing freedom. Pain thinks suffering will create peace. And Griffith thinks the dream justifies the cost. That's what makes them terrifying. They don't wake up and say, "I want to be a monster." They find a reason. And once they believe that reason strongly enough, every sacrifice starts to look necessary. The scariest anime characters are not always the ones who enjoy cruelty. Sometimes the scariest character is the one who thinks cruelty is just part of the solution. That's the difference. When a character is evil for selfish reasons, the audience knows how to process that. They want power, revenge, control, or destruction. But when a character believes they are fixing the world, everything gets more uncomfortable. Because now the story is not just asking, how far will they go? It's asking, what happens when someone is smart enough, wounded enough, or powerful enough to make their worldview everyone else's problem? That's where certainty becomes dangerous, because certainty gives people permission. Permission to lie, permission to betray, permission to kill, permission to sacrifice others without asking whether those people agree to be part of the plan. And in anime, this character type shows up over and over again. The person who sees the world as broken. The person who believes they alone understand the problem. The person who convinces themselves that if the goal is important enough, the cost becomes acceptable. And that is usually the moment they stop being just a hero, villain, or anti-hero. They become something worse. A person who can no longer afford to be wrong. Light Yagami is probably the cleanest version of this pattern, because at the beginning of Death Note, Light's idea almost sounds understandable. A notebook that can kill criminals. A world full of violence, corruption, and people who seem to escape consequences. And a teenager smart enough to believe he sees the right clearly. That's the trap. Light does not start by saying, "I want to be evil." He starts with the language of justice. He tells himself he is creating a better world. A safer world. A world where bad people are afraid. But the more Death Note goes on, the clearer it becomes that justice was never the full truth. Because Light does not just want criminals punished. He wants to be the one who decides. That is the difference. If Light only cared about justice, he would question himself. He would fear what the notebook was doing to him. He would hesitate when innocent people became inconvenient. But Light's real horror is that he cannot tolerate a world where he is not the judge. Once people challenge him, they stop being human beings with their own moral weight. They become threats to the new world. And once Light starts calling himself the god of that world, the mask fully slips. Justice becomes ego. That's what makes him terrifying. Not just that he kills, but that every death becomes easier to justify, because Light has already decided that his vision matters more than anyone else's life. The scariest thing about Light is not that the Death Note corrupts him from nothing. It's that it gives him permission to become what he already had the capacity to be. A person who needed to be right so badly that being questioned felt like evil. Lelouch is terrifying in a different way, because unlike Light, Lelouch does care. That is what makes Code Geass so interesting. Lelouch is not just chasing power for the sake of power. He has people he loves. He has a world he hates. He has a reason to believe the system is cruel. And honestly, he is right about a lot of it. Britannia is brutal. The world is unfair. The people in power are willing to crush anyone below them. So when Lelouch decides to fight back, it does not feel empty. It feels personal. But that is exactly where the danger starts. Because once Lelouch sees himself as the person who has to correct the world, everything around him slowly turns into a chessboard. Friends become pieces, enemies become pieces, strangers become pieces. Even the people he loves can become part of the calculation. And the tragedy is that Lelouch knows the cost. That separates him from Light. Light enjoys standing above people. Lelouch suffers under the weight of his choices. But suffering over a sacrifice is not a race to sacrifice. Feeling guilty does not mean the people you used were not used. That is why Lelouch is such a compelling character. He is not terrifying because he lacks emotion. He is terrifying because he keeps finding ways to turn emotion into justification. He cares so much that he convinces himself the cost has to be worth it. Every lie becomes strategy. Every betrayal becomes necessary. Every death becomes part of a larger equation. And by the end, Lelouch becomes one of anime's clearest examples of the burden of needing to be right. Because if he is wrong, then all the people he used were not sacrifices. They were victims, and that is a truth he cannot afford to face until the very end. Eren Yeager is one of the most uncomfortable examples of this pattern because his core desire is not hard to understand. Eren wants freedom. That is there from the beginning. He hates cages. He hates walls. He hates being trapped by a world that decides what people are allowed to know, where they are allowed to live, and how much truth they are allowed to have. That part of Eren is easy to root for, but Attack on Titan slowly changes the meaning of freedom. At first, freedom means seeing the outside world. Then it means defeating the Titans. Then it means protecting his friends. Then it means destroying the enemies across the sea. And eventually, freedom stops feeling like a possibility, and it starts feeling like a sentence. That is what makes Eren terrifying. He becomes so locked into his vision of freedom that he stops treating the future as something that can be changed. He treats it like something that has to happen. That shift matters, because when a character believes the future is inevitable, responsibility starts to blur. They can tell themselves, this was always going to happen. They can tell themselves, there was no other way. They can tell themselves, I had no choice. But those words are dangerous, because sometimes, I had no choice really means, I cannot accept a world where I chose differently. Eren becomes monstrous because he turns his own desire for freedom into a justification for taking freedom away from everyone else. That contradiction is the core of his tragedy. He wants his people to be free, but he traps the world inside his decision. He wants his friends to live, but he makes them carry the trauma of stopping him. He wants an open world, but his answer is destruction on a scale so massive, it crushes possibility itself. Eren is terrifying because by the end, he does not just believe he is right, he believes he is inevitable. And once a person sees themselves as inevitable, everyone else becomes part of the path. Eren's certainty comes from freedom. Pain's certainty comes from suffering, and that may be even harder to argue with. Pain is terrifying because his worldview is built from something real. He is not wrong that the world is cruel. He is not wrong that war creates children who inherit pain they never chose. He is not wrong that powerful nations often create suffering, and then act shocked when that suffering comes back to them. That is what makes Pain different from a villain who is simply delusional. Pain's ideology begins with truth, but then he turns that truth into a prison. Because Pain does not just say, I suffered. He says, because I suffered, I understand the world. And then he takes the next step. Because I understand suffering, I have the right to force that understanding onto everyone else. That is where he becomes monstrous. Pain takes his trauma and turns it into a universal law. He believes peace can only come when people share the same pain. So instead of breaking the cycle, he tries to control it. He uses suffering as a language, a lesson, a weapon. And in a way, that makes him one of Naruto's strongest ideological villains. Because Naruto cannot defeat him by simply saying, you are wrong and I am good. Pain's argument has weight. He is what happens when grief becomes philosophy, when trauma becomes politics, when someone hurt by the world decides the only way to make people understand pain is to make them feel it too. But that is the danger. Pain confuses understanding suffering with owning suffering. He believes his pain gives him authority, and once he believes that, everyone else's pain becomes something he can use. That is why Naruto's response matters. Naruto does not deny the pain. He refuses to let pain be the final answer. Pain needed his suffering to explain the world. Naruto had to believe the world could be more than suffering. And that difference is everything. Pain turns suffering into ideology. Griffith turns ambition into destiny. Griffith might be the most disturbing version of this pattern because he does not just want to be right. He needs his dream to mean something. That is what makes him so dangerous. Griffith's dream is beautiful from a distance. A kingdom, a future, a place above the world he was born into. And for a while, that dream gives people purpose. The Band of the Hawk follows him because Griffith makes them feel like they are part of something larger than themselves. That is his power. He does not just lead people, he gives their lives direction. But the darker side of Griffith is that the dream always sits above everything else. Above friendship, above loyalty, above love, above the people who bleed to make it real. And the terrifying part is that Griffith does not see the dream as just a desire. He sees it as destiny. That changes everything. Because a desire can be questioned. A destiny demands to be fulfilled. And once Griffith starts viewing his dream as something that must happen, the people around him become part of the price. That is why his betrayal is so horrifying. It is not random. It is not impulsive in the simple sense. It is the final, monstrous expression of a belief he carried all along, that the dream mattered more than the people who helped build it. Griffith is what happens when ambition becomes sacred, when a person needs a destination to justify everybody left on the road behind them. And that is why he fits this pattern so perfectly. Light needs to be the judge, Lelouch needs the sacrifice to mean something, Eren needs the future to be inevitable, Pain needs suffering to explain the world, Griffith needs the dream to be worth the cost. Because if the dream is not worth the cost, then Griffith is not a visionary. He is just someone who destroyed everyone who loved him. And that truth is unbearable. What connects all these characters is not that they have the same goal. They do not. Light wants justice, Lelouch wants liberation, Eren wants freedom, Pain wants peace, Griffith wants his dream. The goals are different, but the pattern is the same. Each of them reaches a point where they stop asking a very important question. What if I'm wrong? That is the line. Not killing, not lying, not sacrificing. Those are actions. The deeper line is when a character loses the ability to seriously question their own answer. Because once they stop asking, what if I'm wrong, everything becomes easier. The victims become necessary, the betrayal becomes necessary, the destruction becomes necessary, the monster becomes necessary. And that is why these characters are so powerful in anime. They are not just cautionary tales about evil, they are cautionary tales about certainty. About what happens when intelligence, trauma, ambition, love, and pain all attach themselves to one answer. One worldview, one dream, one future, one idea of justice. And the scary thing is that these characters are not always wrong at the beginning. That is the uncomfortable part. Light is right that the world has injustice. Lelouch is right that Britannia is cruel. Eren is right that his people are trapped. Pain is right that war creates endless suffering. Griffith is right that dreams can give people purpose. But being right about the problem does not make you right about the solution. That is the mistake they all make. They confuse understanding the wound with having the right to cut the world open. And by the time they realize what they've become, if they ever realize it, the damage is already done. That is why anime characters who need to be right are so terrifying, because they do not always look like monsters at first. Sometimes they look like heroes. Sometimes they look like revolutionaries. Sometimes they look like victims. Sometimes they look like dreamers. And sometimes they really are those things. But the danger begins when their answer becomes more important than the people around them. When being right matters more than being honest. When the dream matters more than the people who believed in it. When justice matters more than mercy. When freedom matters more than anyone else's future. That is when certainty becomes monstrous. Because the scariest anime characters are not always the ones who know they are evil. Sometimes, they are the ones who believe they are the only person brave enough to do what needs to be done. And that belief can destroy the world. If you like anime analysis that looks under the surface, subscribe to ReservedOtaku. And let me know in the comments, which anime character becomes dangerous because they needed to be right. And if you want the opposite side of this idea, check out my video on why anime's kindest heroes are always the scariest.